In the dim light of oil lanterns swaying with the motion of waves, this photograph captured what few ever saw and even fewer dared to document: the hold of a slave ship, dated 1841, a floating prison carrying 135 souls toward oblivion. The wooden planks of the hull form a cramped corridor, barely high enough to sit upright in. Down the center runs a thick iron chain, connecting dozens of shackled people into one grotesque line. Men, women, and children sit or lie on the bare boards, their bare feet locked in heavy iron cuffs. Two lanterns hang precariously from the low ceiling beams, casting weak, stuttering light that creates long shadows and makes the space feel even more oppressive than it truly is. The air itself seems to press down on everyone trapped below. The faces in this photograph tell different stories. Some stare directly at the camera with expressions that can only be called defiance. Eyes that refuse to break, refuse to surrender even in these conditions. Others look away, their gaze fixed on nothing, their eyes glazed with the thousand-yard stare of the defeated. Several women clutch children to their bodies in protective gestures that cannot provide real protection, only the illusion of it. One man in the front row, his face partially hidden in shadow, sits with a perfectly straight back despite the chains binding his hands and feet. His posture speaks of something the overseers tried to break but couldn't, not yet anyway. Dignity. Unbroken human dignity. This photograph was taken aboard the merchant vessel Creole in October 1841, somewhere between Richmond, Virginia, and the slave markets of New Orleans. What the camera could not capture was the smell. Human waste mixed with sweat and fear, concentrated in a space designed to hold cargo, not people. The air was thick enough to taste, and every breath felt like drowning. What it couldn't capture was the sound, the constant creak of the wooden hull as it moved through the water, the endless rattle of chains with every movement of the ship, the quiet weeping that never completely stopped, and the whispers, always the whispers, men and women talking in voices barely audible, sharing information, sharing hope, sharing rage. Among the 135 enslaved people crammed into this floating prison was a man named Madison Washington. He sat in that hold, his wrists raw and bleeding from iron cuffs that never seemed to loosen, and he remembered what freedom tasted like. Because unlike most of the souls chained alongside him, Madison Washington had already escaped slavery once. He had made it all the way to Canada, had breathed air that didn't belong to anyone but him, had worked for wages of his own choosing, had slept without fear of being discovered and dragged back. He had been free, truly free. For one whole year, he had lived as a human being instead of property. But he came back. He came back to Virginia, back to the land of his enslavement, back to a danger he knew intimately and understood too well. He came back because his wife was still in chains. She was being transported on this very ship, somewhere among the hundreds of people crowded below deck, and he could not abandon her to New Orleans and the auction block and a new master somewhere in the deep South. So he returned, and they caught him. They threw him in a Richmond slave pen with dozens of others awaiting sale, and from there he was loaded onto the Creole along with his wife and 133 others to be transported to the slave markets of New Orleans, where he would be sold at auction like livestock. Now he was being shipped south to slavery as a commodity, to be sold on the block like livestock, to disappear into the cotton fields and sugar plantations of the deep South, where escape was nearly impossible and death often came before freedom. The slavers who owned the Creole thought they were simply transporting property. The ship's captain, Robert Ensor, had made this run before without incident. His crew of 9 men considered it routine work. The white passengers who had booked passage thought nothing of sharing a vessel with human cargo. John Hewell, the professional slave trader traveling aboard to manage his merchandise and protect his investment, had transported thousands of enslaved people without problem. They were all complacent. They had no idea what kind of man sat in chains below their feet. Madison Washington was 31 years old, powerfully built from decades of labor, and possessed of a quality that terrified slaveholders more than any weapon or physical force ever could: intelligence. Dangerous, calculating, fully aware intelligence. He had listened carefully to stories of the Amistad, the slave ship that had been seized by its captives just 2 years earlier in 1839. He knew that Sengbe Pié called Joseph Cinque by his captors and his fellow rebels, had taken control of that ship and won their freedom in court. The story had spread through slave quarters across the South, whispered in the fields where men and women worked, shared in the darkness of cabins at night. It had given people something they weren't supposed to have: hope, the knowledge that resistance was possible, that the system was not invulnerable, that men and women could fight back and win. As the Creole sailed south along the Atlantic coast in the first week of November, cutting through cold water and heading inexorably toward the slave markets of New Orleans, Washington began to plan. He identified the others, the ones whose eyes still held fire, the ones who would rather die trying to escape than spend decades in the fields of the Deep South. Elijah Morris, Ben Blacksmith, Doc Ruffin, 18 men in total, including Washington. Each man carefully recruited through whispered conversations during the brief moments when guards weren't watching. Each man sworn to secrecy. Each man made to understand what the cost of failure would be. Each man prepared to risk everything for one chance at freedom. They had no weapons. The hold was searched regularly for contraband. Security was tight because the owners and traders knew the cargo below was valuable and dangerous. But Washington understood something fundamental about human nature and desperation. Desperate men don't need weapons in the traditional sense. They need only opportunity and the will to act. They need only the moment when the guard's attention wanders or when the crew is scattered and vulnerable. These men had both opportunity and will in abundance. They had nothing to lose and freedom to gain. And they had witnessed what Madison Washington had witnessed. They knew the Amistad story. They knew it could be done. On the night of November 6, 1841, as the Creole sailed through calm waters approximately 130 miles from the Bahamian coast, Captain Ensor made a decision that would change the course of American history. Believing he was close to Abaco Island, he ordered the ship to heave to for the night. The vessel drifted quietly in the darkness. Most of the crew and passengers went to sleep. The night watch was minimal, just a skeleton crew to watch the ship while it sat idle in the water. In the hold below, Madison Washington and his conspirators waited. They had discussed the plan in whispers so quiet that even those listening carefully could barely hear. They knew the layout of the ship intimately. They knew where the crew slept. They knew where the captain kept his quarters. They knew the moment was coming, and they had prepared themselves mentally and spiritually for what would happen next. And now, in the darkness of November 7th, that moment had finally arrived. Washington sent a signal through the darkness. A slave was sent topside with a message for the first mate, Zephaniah Gifford. There was a disturbance in the women's section of the hold. A man had crossed over into that area, causing trouble. Someone needed to come investigate immediately. It was a ruse, a deliberate trap, and it worked perfectly. Gifford and William Merritt, one of the passengers who owned several of the enslaved people aboard, immediately went below deck to investigate the supposed problem. The trap was sprung with sudden violence. Merritt was grabbed immediately by multiple sets of hands, overwhelmed and subdued before he could even cry out. Gifford was seized and dragged down into the hold, beaten so severely that blood ran from his face. He was knocked unconscious by sheer force and numbers. The sound of the beating brought nervous tension to the deck above. Then Madison Washington gave the signal, and 19 men exploded from the forward hold onto the open deck, armed with whatever they could find. They had fashioned weapons from the limited materials available: handspikes meant for moving cargo, pieces of iron, anything that could be used as a club or blade. Washington's voice cut through the chaos of the night like a command from the heavens. "Come up, every damned one of you! If you don't lend a hand, I will kill you all and throw you overboard." It wasn't just a call to action. It was a declaration that neutrality was impossible. You were either with them or against them. You either fought for freedom or you accepted slavery. Captain Ensor, awakened by the commotion and the sounds of violence below deck, rushed from his cabin armed with a Bowie knife. John Hewell, the slave trader, tried to hold back the rebels at the companionway, fighting desperately to maintain control of the ship. What happened next was controlled chaos, violence, a desperate fight for survival on both sides. The rebels swung handspikes and pieces of iron. The crew fought back with whatever they could grab: fists, knives, pieces of rope. In the darkness and confusion, it was impossible to tell who was winning. Then Hewell went down. He was stabbed repeatedly by multiple men wielding knives taken from the ship. Blood poured from his wounds as he collapsed on the deck. dying from injuries that no one could heal. His body lay there in the darkness, a stark symbol of what the rebels were willing to do to achieve freedom. John Hewell, the slave trader who had transported thousands of human beings to their doom, was dead. Captain Ensor was severely beaten and stabbed in the starboard scuppers. The rebels were screaming, "Kill the son of a bitch! Kill him!" But somehow, despite his wounds and the overwhelming numbers, Ensor managed to crawl away, climbing into the rigging to escape the violence below, blood pouring from his wounds and mixing with seawater. The second mate, Lucius Stevens, was chased from his cabin, shot at with a musket, beaten with pieces of flagstaff. He scrambled up into the fore shrouds, climbing higher and higher into the rigging, hiding in the darkness above, while the rebels controlled the deck below. 3 ship's officers now clung to the rigging, wounded and terrified, while the enslaved people they had been transporting as cargo took command of the vessel. By dawn, the Creole belonged to Madison, Washington. 135 enslaved people had seized control of an American slave ship on the high seas. 19 brave men had led an uprising that would become the most successful slave revolt in United States history. What happened next would shock the nation and send diplomatic shockwaves across the Atlantic. The impossible had become reality. The sun rose on November 8, 1841, casting long shadows across the Atlantic Ocean. Madison, Washington stood at the helm of the Creole, his raw and bloodied hands gripping the ship's wheel. His knuckles were split open from the violence of the night before. Blood had caked and dried beneath his fingernails. His chest heaved with exhausted breaths, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating, focused on the horizon ahead. Behind him, 128 enslaved people moved across the ship's deck with a combination of jubilation and disbelief, as if they were afraid that moving too slowly or too quickly would somehow break the spell of freedom that had suddenly, impossibly, engulfed them. The crew remained trapped in the rigging above, still secured, still watched. Captain Robert Ensor lay below deck, his fractured skull wrapped in blood-stained cloth. The pain was excruciating, but not as excruciating as his understanding of what had transpired. He had lost control of his own vessel. Enslaved people, cargo that was supposed to be docile, controllable, subordinate, had seized his ship with their bare hands and makeshift weapons. His entire worldview, the fundamental assumptions upon which his life had been built, had been shattered as surely as his skull. William Merritt, the wealthy passenger who owned several of the people now freely moving across the deck, sat in a locked cabin with guards positioned outside the door. He was alive only because Washington needed him. Navigation. That single word defined Merritt's value now. For the first time in his life, a man who had owned dozens of human beings was owned by them in return, his life entirely dependent upon his usefulness. "What is our course?" Washington asked him, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. It was not a request. It was not negotiable. Merritt looked up at him, his face ashen, his wealthy confidence completely evaporated. He had seen men die last night. He had heard the screams. He had felt the rage of people he had assumed were incapable of genuine rage. "The Bahamas," he said, his voice hoarse, barely audible. "The Bahamas lie northwest. If we maintain our course, if we sail through the night—" He paused, calculating, attempting to bargain even now. "We can reach Nassau by tomorrow morning, perhaps afternoon." "The Bahamas," Washington repeated, something shifting in his expression. Not satisfaction exactly, something closer to the first hint of hope. "The Bahamas, where the British freed the people from the Hermosa." "Yes," Merritt said quietly, "where the British freed them." Washington did not smile. He had never been a man prone to smiling, but something in his shoulders relaxed fractionally. He turned to leave the cabin, then paused at the doorway. "You will navigate for us. You will be accurate. You will be truthful. If you attempt deception, you will join Hewell in death. His body is still cooling in the hold. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The message was perfectly clear. The old order had been inverted. The enslaved were now in command. The enslavers were now prisoners. This was not negotiation. This was revolution at sea. Word spread through the ship like wildfire. The Bahamas. Freedom. The British abolished slavery there. 7 years ago, when the Hermosa ran aground, the British freed all 38 enslaved people aboard. 38 people. Had any of them been caught? Had they been returned? No. No one had heard of them being returned. They had disappeared into freedom like stones dropped into deep water, leaving only ripples in their wake. In the hold, where the air was thick and fetid, where the smell of human waste and suffering had been unbearable just hours earlier, the atmosphere transformed completely. People wept openly. Some fell to their knees. Some began to sing old songs, spirituals, songs of lament that had been sung in fields and quarters across the South, songs that suddenly contained new meaning, new power. An elderly woman named Ruth, who had watched her children sold away one by one over the years, sat in a corner and rocked back and forth, her lips moving silently, her eyes fixed on nothing. When her neighbor asked her what she was thinking, she could only shake her head. There were no words. The human mind could not contain this much relief, this much unexpected grace. Madison Washington moved through the ship like a general surveying his conquered territory, but he was not surveying conquest. He was ensuring survival. Survival required order. Order required discipline. Discipline required that everyone understand what was at stake and what was expected. He gathered the men who had participated in the uprising in a small cabin below deck, 19 men in total: Elijah Morris, Ben Blacksmith, Doc Ruffin. Men who had risked everything on a single night of coordinated violence. Men who now faced uncertain futures. Some wanted to discuss what would happen next. Some wanted to celebrate. Washington cut through all of it with a clarity that was almost chilling. "We are not safe yet," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the small space. "We will not be safe until we reach the Bahamas. After we reach the Bahamas, we may not be safe then either. The Americans will fight for us. The American consul will try to reclaim us. Do not mistake temporary advantage for lasting freedom. What we have won tonight is a beach on an island. We have not yet reached the mainland of freedom. Do you understand me?" The men understood, or at least they understood enough. Washington then took on a task that was both practical and symbolic. He ordered every official document aboard the Creole destroyed. Bills of sale, manifests, logbooks, crew registers, all of it, every piece of paper that documented their enslavement, was gathered and burned in a metal barrel on the deck. He watched the flames consume the records of his own ownership. William Merritt's name. Hundreds of prices calculated in dollars. Hundreds of lives reduced to accounting entries. All of it transformed into ash. "Let them search for proof," Washington said to the men around him. "Let them arrive in the Bahamas wondering who we are. Let them attempt to take us back without documentation, without manifest, without any official record that we were ever anyone's property. Words without papers are just words, and we will have hundreds of witnesses to contradict those words." It was, some would later say, a stroke of genius. It was also desperate improvisation. But in that moment, the two were indistinguishable. The voyage to the Bahamas took less than 2 days. On the morning of November 9th, 1841, the crew sighted land. The call went out through the ship. "Land! Land ahead!" The Creole sailed into Nassau Harbor as the sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays turning the water from deep blue to brilliant turquoise. Merchants on the dock began to notice something unusual about this ship. Its sails were somewhat torn. Its approach seemed irregular. There were dark-skinned faces on the deck, which was not unusual, but something about their positioning, their demeanor, suggested they were not crew. The harbor pilot and his team boarded the Creole as they would board any incoming vessel. This was standard procedure. What they found, however, was anything but standard. The ship's officers were injured and clearly under guard. Enslaved people were walking freely on the deck. White passengers were being watched by black men with weapons. The pilot, himself a man of African descent, understood immediately what had transpired. He had heard the stories. He knew what freedom looked like when it had just been seized. He approached Madison Washington directly, and when he spoke, the words he chose would echo through American and British history. "Under Bahamian law, you are free. All of you, every single person aboard this vessel. Slavery was abolished in these colonies 7 years ago. The moment your ship entered these waters, you became free, not conditionally, not temporarily, free, legally, officially, absolutely free." The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. People began to cry, not soft tears, but racking sobs. Women embraced each other. Men fell to their knees. The weight, the unbearable, suffocating weight that they had carried their entire lives, the knowledge that their bodies, their labor, their very existence belonged to someone else, began to lift. For 128 of the 135 people who had boarded the Creole as cargo, freedom was no longer theoretical. It was not something to hope for in an abstract, distant future. It was immediate. It was real. It was legal. It was theirs. But freedom for 128 did not mean freedom for all. The 19 men who had led the uprising, Madison Washington, Elijah Morris, Ben Blacksmith, Doc Ruffin, and the others, were detained immediately. British authorities, conscious of the sensitivities involved and of American diplomatic pressure, decided that while the others were legally free under Bahamian law, those who had committed acts of violence against white crew members required investigation. They were charged with mutiny. They were arrested. They were held in custody in Nassau jail, while British officials and American representatives attempted to determine what to do with them. The American consul in Nassau was a man named John Bacon, and Bacon was determined. He understood what the loss of 128 enslaved people meant to American commerce. He understood what the example of successful slave rebellion could inspire throughout the South. He immediately began mobilizing to attempt to reclaim not just the ship, but the rebels. Bacon visited Captain Ensor in his quarters. The captain was in agony, his head wrapped in bandages, his eyes glazed with fever. Bacon listened to his account of the uprising with growing fury. He then took a more aggressive approach. He went into the streets of Nassau attempting to hire mercenaries. He tried to purchase weapons. He attempted to bribe dock workers to help him retake the ship. He presented himself as the representative of American property rights, as a man whose mission was to restore order and justice to a situation that had spiraled into chaos. What Bacon had not anticipated was that Nassau had changed in the 7 years since Britain abolished slavery. The local population, many of them formerly enslaved people who themselves had been freed when Britain abolished slavery in the Caribbean colonies, had no sympathy for his cause. No merchant would sell him weapons. No dock worker would accept his bribes. In fact, something quite different began to happen. The Bahamian Young Men's Friendly League, a pro-emancipation organization, obtained a legal writ of habeas corpus for all the enslaved people aboard the ship. They began to organize small boats, rowing out into Nassau Harbor again and again. They began ferrying the freed people ashore, one family at a time, 2 by 2, ensuring that anyone who attempted to reclaim them would have to arrest British-protected free persons on British soil. The British authorities, represented by soldiers from the 2nd West India Regiment, many of them black soldiers recruited from West Africa to serve the British Empire, made their position unmistakably clear. When Bacon and Captain Ensor attempted to board the Creole by force to regain control of the vessel, the soldiers of the regiment aimed their muskets directly at them. "Leave now, or you will be arrested," one of the British officers commanded. The irony was profound. British troops, many of them themselves formerly enslaved or the descendants of the enslaved, were now protecting black freedom fighters from American enslavers. The world had been turned completely upside down. The detention of Madison Washington and his fellow rebels lasted for months. They were held in custody in Nassau jail, their fate uncertain. Would the British extradite them to the United States? Would they face American courts and American justice? Would they be executed as examples? Would they be hanged for piracy and murder? The uncertainty was a form of torture in itself. But slowly, legal arguments began to work in their favor. British lawyers and judges studied the case carefully. They examined the facts. They considered the law. By the rules of international jurisdiction, the uprising had occurred on an American ship on the high seas. The victims were American citizens. But the accused were not in American custody. They were in British custody. And Britain had no extradition treaty with the United States that would compel them to return the men. The British Admiralty Court began to formulate its position. These men had acted in defense of their own freedom, whether one called it mutiny or resistance, whether one called it murder or self-preservation. The legal reality was that the Bahamian courts had no jurisdiction to try American citizens for crimes committed at sea. The American courts could theoretically try them, but only if they were American citizens. If they were not, if they were in fact formerly enslaved people who had been illegally held, then the entire premise of prosecution might collapse. By April 16, 1842, 5 months after the uprising, the Admiralty Court in Nassau issued its final decision. all charges against Madison Washington and the 19 men were dropped. All of them were declared legally free. They were released from custody and permitted to remain in the Bahamas or Jamaica as they chose. No extradition would occur. No trial would take place in American courts. 128 enslaved people had been freed by the Creole Mutiny. One man, John Hewell, the slave trader, had been killed. And 19 men, by refusing to accept the unacceptable, by choosing action over resignation, by weaponizing their courage and coordination, had secured their own freedom and the freedom of all those around them. But the story did not end in Nassau Harbor. It was only beginning. Back in the United States, the news of what had happened aboard the Creole spread like wildfire through plantations and cities. Abolitionists celebrated it as proof that the enslaved would fight for their freedom, that resistance was possible, that the system was not invulnerable. Slaveholders, on the other hand, experienced something closer to panic. This was the nightmare scenario. This was what they had always feared, a successful slave rebellion, a complete reversal of the established order. In Congress, there were bitter debates about the Creole incident. What had happened was unprecedented in American history. A slave ship had been seized by its cargo. 128 people had been freed on British soil. The precedent was terrifying to slaveholders. What did it mean for slavery if enslaved people could simply seize a ship and sail to freedom? What did it mean for commerce? What did it mean for the security of the entire system? Diplomatic notes were exchanged between Washington and London. America demanded that Britain return the rebels. Britain refused. America demanded compensation for the lost property. Britain refused. The Creole incident became an international crisis that would take years to resolve, and when it was finally resolved, it was more as a compromise than as a victory for either side. And Madison Washington? What happened to him after April 1842? History has lost his trail completely. No records survive. No personal accounts exist. No letters have been discovered. It is as if he simply vanished into the freedom he had fought so desperately to achieve. Some accounts suggest he settled in Jamaica. Others claim he remained in the Bahamas. A few later reports, decades after the fact, claimed that he had somehow made his way to Canada, but none of this can be verified. What we know is this: he escaped slavery not once, but twice. He liberated not just himself and his wife, but 127 other human beings. He faced death and chose to act anyway. He held his nerve when everything could have fallen apart. He transformed a cargo hold into a refuge for freedom, if only temporarily. He transformed a slave ship into a vessel of liberation, and then he disappeared into the life he had earned, free, truly, completely, irreversibly free. Whether anyone ever spoke his name again in the places he went, we may never know. But for one brief, shining moment in November 1841, Madison Washington was the most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere. Not because he wielded weapons or commanded armies, but because he had the courage to say no, to say that he would not be owned, that his wife would not be owned, that no human being should be owned. Madison Washington stood on the dock in Nassau, watching the morning light break across the harbor waters. Behind him, the Creole was being inspected by British officials. Around him, men and women, 128 of them, were experiencing something that most enslaved people in America never dared imagine. They were free. Not someday, not in some distant future. Free now, free today. Free legally, officially, irrevocably. He did not smile. Madison had never been a man prone to smiling, but something in his shoulders released, some tension that had been coiled there since the moment he first heard the chains being fastened to his legs aboard the Creole. He thought of his wife. She was among those who had walked ashore that morning, her face streaked with tears of a kind he had never seen before. Not tears of pain, tears of disbelief, tears of liberation. "We did it," Ben Blacksmith said, coming to stand beside him. "We actually did it." Madison turned to look at his friend. Ben had been instrumental in steering the others toward Nassau, toward British territory. He had known about the Hermosa. He had known that freedom existed in these waters, that escape was not a fantasy, but a destination. "No," Madison said quietly. "We did half of it. The real battle, that is just beginning." He was right. 5 enslaved people had chosen to remain aboard the Creole, either too frightened to embrace freedom or hoping to return to the South. They would sail back to New Orleans and into bondage. The 19 men who had led the uprising, Madison included, were detained by British authorities, charged with mutiny, their fates uncertain. But what Madison could not yet know was how far the ripples of what they had done would extend, how deep they would penetrate, how fundamentally they would alter the conversation about slavery in America itself. News of the Creole Mutiny reached Richmond 2 weeks after the ship arrived in Nassau. The reaction was electric. Plantation owners gathered in urgent meetings. Slave traders cursed and demanded action. Letters were sent frantically to Washington. The question echoed through the South with a kind of terrified urgency. How could this have happened? How could 128 enslaved people simply seize a ship and sail to freedom? But beneath the rage and panic was something deeper: fear. A primal fear that the enslaved were no longer the passive, accepting property they had always claimed them to be. A fear that resistance was possible, that rebellion could succeed. In the slave quarters of plantations throughout Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, the story of the Creole spread like fire through dry grass. A man named Samuel, who worked in a tobacco field outside Fredericksburg, heard it from a traveling merchant. He began to imagine it, to believe it was possible. A woman named Mary, working in the rice fields of low country South Carolina, heard whispered accounts of what had happened. 19 enslaved men had fought. They had killed a white man. They had seized control of a ship. They had made themselves free. The knowledge settled in her mind like a seed. Not immediately, but over time, it began to grow. In New Orleans, the Creole scandal was met with fury. Slaveholders had lost their human cargo. Merchants had lost their investments. The financial impact was secondary to the psychological one. The system had been breached. The assumption of absolute control had been violated. In Congress, the political earthquake began almost immediately. Representative Joshua Reed Giddings of Ohio, an abolitionist whose strong moral principles were matched only by his legal acumen, rose to introduce 9 carefully crafted resolutions on January 25, 1842. When he spoke, his words reverberated through the chamber with the force of a declaration. "The Constitution of these United States," Giddings declared, his voice measured but resolute, "grants to Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. The transport of enslaved people by ship, this coastwise slave trade, is commerce, interstate commerce, and where the Constitution grants Congress power, the states have none. I therefore submit to this body that those enslaved people aboard the Creole, the moment their ship left Virginia waters and sailed beyond any state's jurisdiction, ceased to be property. They became free persons under the Constitution itself. They were not rebels. They were not criminals. They were people exercising their constitutional right to liberty." The Southern response was immediate and apoplectic. The resolutions were attacked, vilified, called seditious. But Giddings had struck at something fundamental. If his argument was correct, if enslaved people automatically became free the moment they left state jurisdiction, then the entire coastwise slave trade was constitutionally vulnerable. More than that, it raised questions about slavery itself as a national institution. "We must crush this movement at its source," one congressman from Georgia thundered, "or we will see rebellion on every plantation from the Chesapeake to the Gulf." But something had shifted. For the first time in American history, a successful slave revolt had not been suppressed. For the first time, those who had seized their own freedom had kept it, and for the first time, this reality had made its way into the halls of power itself. Former President John Quincy Adams, now serving in the House at the age of 84, rose to support Giddings' resolutions. Adams was frail, his mind sometimes clouded by age, but on this issue his moral clarity was absolute. He had spent his entire life opposing slavery. He had even hidden fugitive enslaved people in his own home. "This young man speaks truth," Adams said, gesturing toward Giddings. "And that truth terrifies those who profit from human bondage. The Creole incident is not an anomaly. It is a harbinger. It is the beginning of what will inevitably come. The enslaved will resist. They will fight. And the question before us is not whether we will stop them. We cannot stop them. But rather whether we will stand with freedom or remain complicit with tyranny." The Southern response to Adams was venomous. Representative Henry Wise of Virginia introduced a censure motion, accusing Adams of plotting with Britain to destroy slavery. The accusation was absurd, but it revealed something essential about how the South viewed the world. They saw abolition not as a political philosophy, but as a conspiracy, a coordinated attack, a plot against their entire way of life. By spring of 1842, word had reached enslaved people throughout the South that the British had refused to return the rebels, that the diplomatic crisis was escalating, that Britain and America were in conflict over the Creole Mutiny itself. In the quarters of plantations, in the kitchens of great houses, in the fields where people labored without choice, the story was retold, embellished, transformed. Some versions claimed that all of the men had survived. Others insisted they had all gone free. The details shifted with each telling, but the core truth remained. Enslaved people could resist, could fight, could win. A man named Isaiah, working on a plantation near the Roanoke River, heard the story and began to think about the gun his master kept in the study. Could they seize it? Could they do what Madison Washington had done? A woman named Clementine, working in a house in Charleston, heard the story and began to think about the poisons in the mistress's medicine cabinet. What could she do with them? The psychological shift was profound. The Creole Mutiny had done something that no abolitionist speech, no moral argument, no religious sermon could accomplish. It had proven that the system was not invincible, that desperate courage could overcome overwhelming odds, that freedom was not a distant abstraction, but something that could be grasped and held. In the fall of 1842, Daniel Webster, Secretary of State under President John Tyler, began negotiations with the British over the Creole case. It was one issue among many: border disputes, the Caroline Affair, extradition treaties, but it was the most charged, the most personal. Webster understood what was at stake. 128 enslaved people represented millions of dollars in lost property. It represented a fundamental breach in the system of slavery. It represented a precedent that, if not addressed, could encourage further rebellions. When Webster finally addressed the British negotiator, Lord Ashburton, he was direct. The United States demanded the return of the rebels. The United States demanded compensation for the lost human cargo. The United States demanded that Britain acknowledge its error in freeing people who, under American law, were property. Ashburton listened patiently. Then he responded with diplomatic clarity that could not be negotiated away. Any person who reaches British soil, Ashburton said carefully, or British colonial soil, will be granted freedom under British law. This is not a matter of policy. It is not negotiable. It is law, British law, and it applies to every person who reaches British territory, regardless of their origin or legal status in other nations. Webster understood in that moment that he would not prevail. Britain would not return the rebels. Britain would not acknowledge that enslaved people were property in the eyes of British law. What emerged from the Webster-Ashburton negotiations was compromise born of defeat. Britain would pay 110 330s in compensation for the lost enslaved people, not because Britain acknowledged that enslaved people were property, but as a gesture to ease tensions between the two nations. Additionally, Britain agreed that in the future, its officials in the West Indies would attempt to avoid such incidents when possible, though they would not actively interfere with people seeking refuge from slavery. It was not what the South wanted. It was not a victory. It was a grudging acknowledgement that the Creole Mutiny had changed something fundamental in the relationship between the two nations. The impact of the Creole Mutiny rippled outward across the American landscape in ways that would take decades to fully manifest. Every subsequent debate over slavery found someone invoking the Creole. Every abolitionist speech included the story. Every slave rebellion that followed was contextualized against what Madison Washington and his comrades had accomplished. But more important than the political impact was the psychological one. The Creole had planted seeds of possibility in the consciousness of enslaved people that would continue to grow for the next 2 decades. Seeds of the knowledge that freedom existed, that it could be seized, that resistance was not futile. When the Civil War came in 1861, thousands of enslaved people would remember the Creole. Thousands would march with the Union Army, not because they were ordered to, but because they remembered the story of 19 men who had taken a ship and made themselves free. And if 19 men could do it aboard a vessel surrounded by ocean, then surely they could do it as part of an army marching across a continent. Madison Washington never returned to the United States. After being freed by the British courts in April of 1842, he disappeared into the new life he had claimed. Some accounts suggest he settled in the Bahamas. Others claim he made his way to Canada. A few later stories place him in Europe, but none can be verified with certainty. What was known was this: he had lived, he had loved, he had fought for freedom, he had won, and in winning, he had changed history itself. But the story did not end in Nassau. It did not end in Congress. It did not end when the courts freed him and his men. It continued, growing, evolving, rippling outward like waves, spreading from a stone dropped into deep water. In the winter of 1842, word began to arrive in the South that something was beginning. Something was being organized. Something that could not be stopped, no matter how many laws were passed or how much compensation was paid. Madison Washington, free at last, had begun to speak. He had begun to tell his story to anyone who would listen. Abolitionists in the North, newspapers that dared publish his words, congregations of free black people in northern cities, and enslaved people, hearing his words repeated and retold, began to understand that the most dangerous weapon against slavery was not violence, though that had its place. It was testimony. It was truth. It was the refusal to remain silent about what bondage truly meant. The Creole Mutiny had set something in motion that would not stop, that could not stop, that would only accelerate and expand until it engulfed the nation itself. By November of 1842, exactly 1 year after the mutiny, secret meetings were being held on plantations throughout the South. Plans were being made, alliances were being forged, escape routes were being traced. The rebellion was coming. Not the individual rebellions of desperate people making isolated attempts to reach freedom, but something far greater. The abolitionist meeting hall in Philadelphia was packed to capacity on a winter evening in February 1843. Row upon row of folding chairs had been arranged hastily, and people from the city, black and white abolitionists, free people of color, sympathetic merchants, clergymen, filled every available space. The air thrummed with anticipation. Word had spread rapidly through the abolitionist network that something unprecedented was going to happen that evening. A man was coming to speak, a man who had actually led it, a man who had seized control of a ship, freed 128 people, and lived to tell the story. Madison Washington stepped onto the modest stage as the room fell into absolute silence. He was not a trained orator. He had never stood before an audience this large before. But the moment he began to speak, everyone in that room understood they were in the presence of something extraordinary. A man transformed by his own actions into a living symbol of resistance. "My name is Madison Washington," he said, his voice steady and measured. "I was born into slavery in Virginia. I worked in fields. I worked in houses. I was beaten. I was treated as property, but I did not accept it." He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle into every listener's consciousness. "I ran away. I made it to Canada. For the first time in my life, I was free to think my own thoughts, free to walk where I wished, free to dream of a life that belonged to me." He stopped again, and when he resumed, his voice carried a note of profound sorrow. "But I was not satisfied with my own freedom while my wife remained in chains. Her name was Susan. She was still enslaved in Virginia. So I went back. I went back knowing the risk. I went back knowing I might be captured. I went back because love demanded it, and I was caught. They put me in chains again. They sold me at auction. I was being transported to New Orleans when an opportunity presented itself, an opportunity that changed everything." He described the night of November 7th, 1841. He described how he and 18 other men had planned in secret, speaking only in whispers during the dead of night, communicating through glances and gestures that their enslavers could not interpret. He described the moment when they seized their chance, when the crew was distracted, when the upper deck was less populated than usual. "We moved like one body," he said. "We had no weapons but our determination. We had no military training, but we had something more powerful. We had nothing to lose. We had already lost everything. So we fought." He described the struggle. He described the chaos of that night. He described the moment when John R. Hewell, the slave trader, fell. He described the blood on the deck, the screams of the crew members, the terror in the eyes of those who suddenly found themselves facing the very people they had assumed they could control forever. "One man died that night," Madison said quietly. "A slave named Joseph. He died fighting for freedom. Every time I remember his name, I remember that freedom has a cost, that liberation is not free. When Madison described the moment the Creole entered Nassau Harbor, when he described hearing the pilot say that they were on British soil and that they were free under British law, his voice wavered with emotion, only slightly, but it was enough to reveal that beneath the composed exterior stood a man who had lived through experiences that could shatter most human beings. For the first time in my life, he said, I was not property. No one could buy me or sell me. No one could order me to work without payment. No one could beat me or separate me from my family. I had ownership of myself. I had the legal right to exist as a human being. He looked out at the audience, his eyes moving from face to face. Some people will say that the cost was too high. One man dead, others wounded, the disruption of commerce, the challenge to the social order. They will say that we rebels were foolish, that we should have accepted our fate, that we should have waited for someone else to free us. His voice grew stronger. But I tell you this, is there a price too high for freedom? Is there a cost too great to reclaim your own humanity? I say no. I say that every person in those chains would make the same choice we made. And most of you, if you were in those chains, would make the same choice too. In the audience, a tall man with dignified bearing sat listening intently. His name was Frederick Douglass, and he was himself an escaped enslaved person who had become one of the most powerful voices in the abolitionist movement. As he listened to Madison Washington speak, Douglass felt something shift within him. The story of the Creole was not just a story of a ship and a rebellion. It was a story that could inspire thousands. It was a narrative that showed the world what enslaved people were truly capable of when given the opportunity, when they refused to accept their enslavement, when they chose dignity over submission. That evening, after the speech ended and the crowd had begun to disperse, Frederick Douglass sought out Madison Washington. The two men stood in a corner of the hall while the bustle of departure continued around them. What passed between them in that moment was more than simple conversation. It was a moment of profound recognition. Two men who had escaped slavery, who understood the true cost of freedom, who understood that the words they spoke and the stories they told could reshape the consciousness of a nation. Your story must be preserved, Douglass told him, with intensity burning in his eyes. Your story must be told and retold until every person in America knows your name. What you did was not just an act of rebellion. It was not just an act of courage. It was a declaration of human worth. It was proof, irrefutable proof, that the enslaved are not content to remain enslaved. That resistance is possible, that freedom can be seized. In the months that followed, Madison Washington's story spread through the abolitionist network like flame through dry grass. He gave speeches in Boston. He gave speeches in New York. He gave testimony before conventions of abolitionists. Each time, he told the story of the Creole with the same quiet power, the same measured conviction, the same clarity of purpose. And each time he told the story, the impact rippled outward in ways that would not become fully apparent for decades. In the slave quarters of plantations throughout the South, enslaved people heard accounts of what Madison Washington had said. They heard whispered stories about a man who had reclaimed his freedom twice. They heard about 19 men who had seized a ship with their bare hands. They heard about 128 people who were now free in the Bahamas, beyond the reach of American slave traders. And hearing these stories, something shifted in their consciousness. Escape was not a fantasy. Resistance was not futile. Freedom was not impossible. A man named Thomas, working in the fields near the Roanoke River, heard the story and began to plan. He began to think seriously about the Underground Railroad. He began to make careful inquiries, asking questions in oblique ways, learning which roads led north, which safe houses existed, which abolitionists might help. Quietly, carefully. But he began. A woman named Eleanor, enslaved in Richmond, the very city where Madison Washington had been captured and sold to the Creole, heard the story and began to gather information. She knew people who knew people. She knew there were safe houses to the north. She knew there were abolitionists who would help. She began to understand that escape was not an abstraction, but a possibility. The power of Madison Washington's testimony was not in the drama of the rebellion itself. By 1843, when he was speaking, the Creole Mutiny was already 2 years in the past. The immediate drama had faded. What remained was something far more powerful and enduring, the voice of a man who had lived through the transformation from enslaved to free, and who was now using that voice to tell the world that freedom was not a distant dream. It was possible. It was real. It could be achieved. Frederick Douglass was so profoundly moved by Madison Washington's story that he decided to transform it into a form that could reach an even wider audience, those who might never attend an abolitionist meeting, those who might never hear Washington speak in person. In 1853, 12 years after the Creole Mutiny, Douglass published a novella called The Heroic Slave. It was a work of fiction based on Madison Washington's life that told the story of a man who refused to accept slavery and who fought for his freedom with every fiber of his being. In the story, Douglass gave voice to the internal struggles of the protagonist, his rage at injustice, his despair at separation from his loved ones, his determination to be free. Douglass filled the narrative with dialogue and emotional depth that brought the character to life for readers who might never have heard Madison Washington speak directly. He had seen what slavery was, Douglass wrote of his fictional character, who was clearly based on Madison Washington. Not as it is painted in rosy colors by those who profit from it, not as it is described by those who speak of contented slaves and kind masters. He had seen slavery as it truly is, a system of absolute control, a theft of human dignity, a negation of the most basic human rights. And he had decided that he could not continue to accept it, that he would not accept it, that he would rather die free than live enslaved. The impact of The Heroic Slave was profound and lasting. It reached readers who might not have attended abolitionist meetings. It reached people in the North who were uncertain about the morality of slavery. It reached people in the South, passed from hand to hand in secret, read in whispered moments, circulated through the network of abolitionists and sympathizers. And in slave quarters throughout the South, the story was transmitted orally, from person to person, from night to night, told and retold, each telling adding details, each telling emphasizing different aspects of the struggle for freedom. The story evolved and grew, but its essential truth remained constant. One man's refusal to accept slavery could inspire others. One act of courage could echo across generations. By the 1850s, Madison Washington had become a legend, not a legend in the sense of someone whose story had been distorted and exaggerated beyond recognition, though some embellishment certainly occurred in the retelling. Rather, he had become a legend in the sense of someone whose life had taken on emblematic significance. His story represented the possibility of freedom. His defiance suggested that slavery was not inevitable, not unchangeable, not invincible. That resistance was not futile. That change was possible. As the tensions between North and South escalated in the years leading up to the Civil War, the story of Madison Washington and the Creole Mutiny was invoked again and again. Abolitionists pointed to the Creole as proof that enslaved people would fight for their freedom when opportunity presented itself. They pointed to it as evidence that the system of slavery was not stable, not secure, not sustainable. They used it as an argument that slavery could only be maintained through constant escalating violence. Pro-slavery voices, on the other hand, pointed to the Creole Mutiny as evidence of exactly what they feared most. They argued that if slavery were weakened or challenged in any way, if the power of slaveholders were diminished even slightly, then rebellions like the Creole would become commonplace. They saw the mutiny as a harbinger of chaos and violence. They used it to justify increased control and surveillance. What both sides understood, even if they would not admit it publicly, was that the Creole Mutiny had changed something fundamental in the American consciousness. It had shown that enslaved people could organize, could resist, could succeed. And that knowledge could not be suppressed. It could not be unlearned. It could only grow and spread. In the spring of 1861, when the first shots of the Civil War rang out at Fort Sumter, thousands of enslaved people throughout the South knew the story of the Creole. Thousands understood that freedom was not something that would be given to them by benevolent masters or kind-hearted politicians. Freedom was something that had to be seized, that had to be fought for, that had to be claimed. When the Union Army began recruiting enslaved people who had escaped to Union lines, initially with reluctance but eventually with growing enthusiasm, tens of thousands responded. They came not because they had been promised wages. They came not because they had been guaranteed safety. They came because they had heard the story of men who had refused to be enslaved, men who had fought, men who had won. Some of those who joined the Union Army had heard Madison Washington's voice in person. Others had heard his story passed from person to person, transformed by the telling but retaining its essential truth at its core. All of them understood, on some level conscious or intuitive, that they were following in a tradition of resistance that stretched back to November 7th, 1841, when 19 men on a slave ship had decided that they would be free. Madison Washington himself did not fight in the Civil War. What happened to him after 1843 remains shrouded in historical uncertainty. The historical record, having captured his moment of glory and power, then released him back into obscurity. Some accounts suggest he lived out his life in the Bahamas or Jamaica. Others claim he made his way to Canada. A few later stories place him in England or even parts of Africa. But nothing can be verified with absolute certainty. What is known, what is documented and undeniable, is that he lived, that he had been free twice, that he had freed 127 other human beings, that his voice had echoed through the halls of power in the years before the Civil War, that his story had inspired thousands to believe that freedom was possible, that his legacy endured long after his own life had ended. And when the Civil War ended, when slavery itself was abolished by constitutional amendment, when millions of formerly enslaved people began their new lives as free citizens, the legacy of Madison Washington remained. It remained in the stories that grandmothers told their grandchildren. It remained in the historical records that scholars would eventually uncover. It remained in the consciousness of a nation trying to understand how it had come to the brink of destruction and back again. The Creole Mutiny had set in motion forces that would ultimately destroy slavery itself. Not by itself, not through the efforts of one ship and 19 men alone, but as one powerful strand in a larger tapestry of resistance that grew and spread and eventually engulfed the nation. Madison Washington never knew the full extent of his impact. He never knew how many people had heard his story. He never knew how many enslaved people had been inspired by his defiance to attempt their own escapes. He never knew how many soldiers marching with the Union Army had been sustained in their courage by the knowledge that men like him had refused to accept slavery. But history knew. History had recorded it. And history would ensure that the name of Madison Washington, the man who had seized a ship and freed 128 people, the man who had given voice to the possibility of freedom, would not be forgotten. 231 years. That was how long American slavery had endured in the 13 colonies and later the United States. 231 years of systematic oppression. 231 years of human beings treated as property. 231 years of a system built on the absolute negation of human dignity and human rights. And it was ended not just by the Civil War, though that was a major part of it. It was ended by people who refused to accept it. People like Madison Washington. People who said no. People who fought. People who risked everything for the possibility of freedom. On November 7th, 1841, Madison Washington and 18 other men seized a ship and made themselves free. In doing so, they set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to the abolition of slavery in the United States. They did not know this. They could not have known this. They only knew that they wanted to be free. But sometimes that is enough. Sometimes one night of defiance. Sometimes one moment of courage. Sometimes one person's refusal to accept the unacceptable can change the world. Madison Washington changed the world, not by himself, not alone, but as part of a larger chorus of resistance that grew and spread until it could no longer be ignored or suppressed. He was one man. He was one voice. But his voice became 100 voices. Those 100 voices became 1,000. Those 1,000 voices became millions. And those millions cried out for freedom until the system that had enslaved them finally collapsed. This is the story of Madison Washington. This is the story of the Creole Mutiny. This is the story of how one man's refusal to accept slavery became the beginning of the end of slavery itself. This is how history is made, not by great men in great halls making grand pronouncements, but by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances making the choice to fight for what is right, regardless of the cost, regardless of the odds, regardless of whether they will survive to see the outcome. Madison Washington survived. He lived to see his freedom secured. He lived to tell his story. He lived to inspire others to believe that freedom was possible, and his legacy endures. 21st century America, built on the ruins of slavery, still bears the marks of Madison Washington's defiance. still remembers the night when a man refused to be enslaved, still honors the courage of those who fought for freedom when freedom seemed impossible. The Creole was decommissioned years later and eventually rotted into obscurity. The crew members who survived healed from their wounds and returned to their lives. The American government paid Britain compensation and negotiated treaties. Politicians debated and speeches were given. But what truly mattered was that one night in November 1841, one man changed history, and his name was Madison Washington.